When you look at, you're obviously over there in Asia, but you have China, India, some of these countries. I think there's 2.3 billion between those two countries alone. When you look at just a small increase, Jim, in per capita usage of oil in those countries, it really is staggering. And as you said, what's a million barrels when there's 85 million barrels used a day? As these nations develop, I guess my question to you, Jim, is where is the oil going to come from?
Well, that's my point. Unless somebody finds a whole lot very quickly, the world's going to have a gigantic problem down the road, and it's got to be very accessible oil that the world's going to find very quickly. If you know, if any of your viewers or listeners know of any big oil, I wish they'd let us all know. I don't want to invest in it too. I mean, Shell would like to know. Exxon would like to know. We would like to know. Where is this oil that's going to drive down the price of oil and keep it down?
In the United States, and then we'll drop oil, but they tend to demonize or want to demonize as the price of gas and oil was going up, the oil companies. But I think, in some cases they should be thankful we've had such cheap oil for so long and they've been able to cultivate it like they have. What about the demonization of these oil companies in Congress and whatnot, Jim? Was that just a farce?
Well, of course it's a farce, but the politicians throughout history have been doing that sort of thing, not just with oil. I mean, probably whenever something goes wrong, politicians blame foreigners or speculators or financiers. Oh, yeah, they've always, throughout history, they've liked to blame financiers and foreigners. So, sure, no, they got to blame somebody. Unfortunately, most politicians, especially in the U.S., apparently, won't take responsibility, and it's easier to blame other people. But blaming the oil companies is not going to bring more oil to market. The politicians can stand up there all day long and say it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. Taxing oil companies is not going to put more gasoline in your tank, and certainly not cheaper gasoline in your tank. No politician is going to go out there and find more oil and deliver it to us at a loss. So they can play that game all day long, but in the end, it just makes the country deteriorate even further. And, the balance of the center of the world is already shifting away from America, unfortunately. It'll just make it even worse.
Let's talk China then, away from America, as you said. At King World News, we receive questions about China from time to time. People are worried about revolution or government instability. And I think, like you, Jim, that people should invest in China for the long term at appropriate valuation levels. Should investors be worried about revolution or instability? What about China, Jim?
Well, I'm worried about instability a lot of places where I suspect there's going to be social unrest in the U.S. as well down the road if things do continue to get worse. We've had, in China, there have been lots of changes in the past 30 years. When I first went to China, there was one newspaper, one radio, one TV, one everything. And the idea of a demonstration was inconceivable. Now there's thousands of demonstrations every year, tens of thousands every year. And people are demanding their rights and are, in many cases, getting their rights because the situation has changed. Will it all fall apart in China? I suspect not. We in the U.S. in the 19th century, had a gigantic civil war. We had constant massacres in the streets. We had very few human rights. We had no rule of law. We had 15 depressions with a D, and yet we came out of that and did pretty well. I suspect China's going to they will have horrible setbacks just as we did, but in the end, I suspect China's going to come out okay. And let's suppose the worst, or the best, depending on how you look at it. Let's suppose they overthrow the government. Well, they're throwing out the communists. Then there would be capitalists coming to run China. Mao Zedong is not coming back to China. So the worst in many cases would be the best, if depending on how you look at things. So I don't see problems in China down the road. None enough they're going to make me change my mind about the investing in China.
You mentioned the possibility about social unrest coming to the United States. Bob Prechter talked about social unrest with me recently when I interviewed him. Peter Schiff today talked to me about the fact that, eventually we may have to make it so people simply can't leave the United States because if the young begin to leave, that's who the U.S. is counting on for the tax-paying base for the older population. What about this issue of, because you brought it up, the social unrest coming to the United States? And I agree with you. How bad will that get if you had to guess?
It could get. If I told you how bad it could get, you'd stop interviewing me. So we'll just leave it at that.
Take a stab at it, Jim. Honestly, the viewers can.
Well, I mean, look, it could be as bad as what happened in the '60s, when at least it brought an end to the Vietnamese War. It could be, in theory, it could be the overthrow of the government and a total change. I I don't expect that's going to happen anytime soon, if ever. But for goodness sakes, we have a lot of, in the 1930s, America had some social unrest, but for the most part, and people marched on Washington back in the 30s, but for the most part, America's population in the 30s was fairly disciplined and docile and well trained or well brought up. I don't think that's the case in the next decade or two. We have a whole different attitude in America of that. We are owed support, we're owed a living, we're owed everything. And so, if things continue to get worse, which they may very well, I think you're going to see more and more angry people in the U.S., and that doesn't lead to good things.
You brought up briefly the marches on Washington in the Depression. The World War I veterans marched on Washington in the Depression. Do you think that was an attempt to overthrow government?
Well, no, it certainly was not an attempt to overthrow government, but there were a lot of very unhappy and angry people there. It was an attempt to make demands and to show that there were a lot of people who were unhappy. And in that particular case, they felt that they were owed perhaps more than other people were owed because they had been, they had risked their lives and they had lost limbs and been injured during the First World War. And if anybody in those days felt they owed something, the World War I veterans were among the best, and said they went and said, we want more. Did it help? I don't know. The New Deal, we now know, didn't solve the problems of the Depression. The handouts didn't work. The handouts, in fact, may have made things worse. But when people are unhappy and angry, they go and they say, give me. Nobody likes to suffer and be hungry.